Hi, paleontologists. Today in reading, we're going to talk about a skill called point of view, which we've definitely all talked about a little bit already. Thinking back to when we were in school, when you get a text for shared reading, we set up the page by putting the point of view at the top, right? And then previewing the text to figure out what point of view it is. Thinking about first or third person point of view. So today, looking over here, our goal is that you will be able to explain the point of view. So you're going to be able to say if it's first person or third person from which a story is narrated. So that's our goal for today. All right, so we're going to use this chart to look at some notes and really think about how are we going to be able to tell what the point of view is, right? So we're going to think about this chart. When you hear the words point of view, you could picture this owl, right? And think, who, like the sound an owl makes, who is telling the story? That's what point of view is. When you are trying to answer what the point of view is, you're thinking, who's telling the story? And your answer in third grade is either going to be first person, which means, looking right here, that the character is telling the story. So the character is part of the story. The narrator is a character inside the story. That's first person. But we could also have a third person narrator. So if the narrator you're deciding is third person, the narrator is telling the story and it's an outside narrator. So it's a narrator outside of the story. The narrator is not one of the characters. So really thinking first person, a character inside the story is telling the story. Third person, it's an outside narrator. So think first person inside, third person outside. We're just going to ignore second person for now. So looking back in the first person column, when you're reading a text and you're trying to figure out if it's first person or third person, you're going to look for some keywords. So keywords for a text that is narrated in the first person are going to be words like I, me, we, our, or my, right? Those are all different kinds of pronouns. And that should make sense that if somebody is inside the story, or even think about if you were telling a story, you would use all of those words, right? If I was going to tell you about a story about grocery shopping the other day, since I'm not doing many other exciting things, I would say I went to the grocery store because it happened to me, right? I'm the one telling the story. I could say I got in my car, right? Those are some keywords. I drove to the store. We walked into the store, all those kinds of things. Those are keywords. I'm telling the story. So that my story would be a first person narrated, right? And that same story in third person, let's say somebody else was telling the story, right? Like I wouldn't say Miss Hope was going to the store if I was telling the story. So that's why in third person, let's say that this was a story that somebody else wrote, said Miss Hope went to the store. She got in her car and drove to the store. They went inside and went shopping, right? That would be the same story, but that is told by a third person narrator. So that was just a little example. And now we'll go on to using our Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing text on the next slide. And I'll show you how we can use these keywords to then decide what point of view the story is and explain a little bit more about it. Okay, so let me show you what I mean. First of all, the reason why being able to explain the point of view is important is because based on who is telling the story, it affects the information that you get as a reader, right? So if a character is inside the story, so it's a first person point of view, they're telling you the story, you're going to learn more about that character's feelings, right? And you're going to learn more because it's coming right from the person. If it's coming from a third person narrator, that narrator might not know as much, like you might not get as good of an inside view from the one character, but that narrator might know more about all of the characters. So there's kind of like pros and cons and things that are different to the different types of narrators. And it's important that as a reader, you're thinking about these things every time that you're reading and you're able to talk about them and explain them. So let's look at, this is the first page, page 35 of chapter 6 from our grade Read Aloud, Tales of Fourth Grade Nothing. And the whole book is told in the same point of view. So just because we're using a page from chapter 6 today, it will still have the same point of view as chapter 1 or any other chapter in the book, right? So I'm going to read a little chunk And we're going to look for those keywords, right? Trying to decide who's telling the story. That's the question we keep asking ourselves over and over again. And thinking, is it first person? Looking for words, somebody that sounds like they're inside the story, looking for words like I, me, we, our. Or is it somebody outside the story, a narrator? And are they using words like he, she, they, names, things like that, right? So let's start reading right here. And I'm going to highlight some keywords, okay? Fudge liked his new bed a lot. There was just one problem. He fell out of it every night. By the fourth night, my mother and father got smart. They pushed the bed against the wall and surrounded the other side with chairs. Now there was no place for Fudge to fall. But every morning, my mother found him curled up in one of the chairs. My father said they could have saved their money, since Fudge was so happy sleeping in an old chair. On Saturday, we had to go to the dentist. He wanted to check Fudge's mouth again, to make sure everything healed all right since his flying experience. Dr. Brown is an old friend of my father's, so we're going to pause there. I'm going to go back and highlight some keywords. Fudge likes his new bed a lot. He fell out of the fourth night. My mother and father got smart. They pushed the bed against the wall. Now there was no place for it. Every morning, my mother, my father, we had to go to the dentist, right? So based on these keywords, I would decide that this text is narrated from a first-person point of view. So that's what I would decide. But now we need to think about why. So going back up to the top, it could be a little tricky if you're just thinking about the keywords. The first really important thing that you do is identify the storytelling voice. That's why it's so important to ask yourself over and over again, who is telling the story? Because if you're just looking for the keywords, you're going to see all kinds of keywords that could go with either person, right? So like where it says Fudge, that's a name. That might lead you to think that it's a third person narrator. But it's actually Peter who's telling the story, right? And he's a character inside the story, so it's first person. It's Peter talking about the other characters. So of course he's going to use names and words like he and they, right? But it's really important that you're identifying that storytelling voice. Like this line right here, by the fourth night, my mother and father got smart, right? So that's Peter telling the story to us. So since he is a character inside the story, I did find the words my, and we. Those all help us decide that it's first person. So now that I showed you how to find the point of view, it's your turn. We're going to use the first page of the story called The Best Worst Thanksgiving. It's going to be on the next slide, but I wanted you to be able to see the title page. So we're going to read just a chunk of that, and then we're going to do some pausing and stopping and thinking so that you can look for some keywords and identify the point of view on your own, right? So we just decided that Tales of Fourth Grade Nothing is told from first person point of view because the story is told by Peter. He's a character inside the story. So the point of view is first person. Now we're going to try with this story, Best Worst Thanksgiving. Okay, so since you can't highlight on the video, obviously, why don't you pause the video and grab a pencil and paper so we can jot down some keywords. Okay, so I'll give you a couple seconds to do that. And then I'm going to read the first chunk. We'll jot down some keywords and talk about what point of view do we think this is. Then it'll be time for you to try on your own. Remember, point of view thinking. Who's telling the story? First person, character inside the story is telling the story. Third person, it's a narrator outside of the story. Okay, we're going to start reading and I'm going to highlight some keywords and you can jot some keywords down as well. So we'll read it a couple times. It was Thanksgiving morning. This year, the Leaf family was traveling from their home in Virginia to Grandma and Grandpa Lee's house in Florida. 9-year-old Zara Lee had been excited about the trip. Then she found out that their beloved dog Tucker had to stay at a kennel. Her family was almost at the airport when Zara spotted Tucker's dog toy on the floor of the taxi. They must have forgotten it when they dropped him off. It had been an emotional goodbye. Dad basically had to tear Zara away from Tucker. Now, Zara found herself blinking back tears as she picked up the ragged dog toy and cradled it in her lap. Tucker was her best friend in the entire world. In the car seat next to her, Zara's little sister Piper kicked her feet and sang the alphabet song. Suddenly, Piper reached over and snatched the dog toy off Zara's lap. "Quit it, Piper!" Zara cried. She tried to yank it back, but Piper held on tight. All of a sudden, a horrible ripping sound filled the taxi. Then clouds of white stuffing flew in the air. Zara stared at the destroyed dog toy in her hands. "You're such a baby," she screamed, causing Piper to burst into tears. So we can decide that this is Piper, right? And this is Zara. "Zara," Mom sighed. "Piper didn't ruin Tucker's toy on purpose. She's only 3 years old, and you're the big sister. So be nice." So now we have to really stop and think. We read a longer chunk because we're not as familiar with that book as the other one. And let's highlight some things. So we have our characters, and by now we have Zara, Mom, Piper. I want you to whisper and cover up. So just like we do at class, I'm going to give you a couple seconds to think time and see if we can tell it at the same time. I want you to whisper between those people. Who do you think is the main character? Whisper the name, cover it up. Tell. Did you say Zara? If you said Zara, you're correct, right? So this, one more time, this is Zara. She's the main character. So thinking back to Tales of the Fourth Grade Nothing, Peter's our main character. He was the one telling the story. So now we want to keep that in mind, that we know Zara is our main character. We have her mom, her little sister that we met. We could probably infer that this is her dad and her brother, right? So now we have to go back and read again and think, so who's telling the story? Is Zara telling us the story, or is it a narrator outside the story? So now's when we want to think about those keywords and really identify the storytelling voice, right? So if Zara is telling us the story, we're going to hear, like, it was Thanksgiving morning. My family was traveling from my home to visit my grandparents. And if it's third person, we're going to hear those pronouns like their, names, those kinds of things. So let's go back. We could just reread the first paragraph and pick out some of those keywords now and really decide this point of view. So it was Thanksgiving morning. This year, the Lee family, that's a name, was traveling from their home in Virginia to Grandma and Grandpa Lee's house in Florida. So there's some more names. 9-year-old Zara Lee. So think about, if they're saying 9-year-old Zara Lee, is she the one telling us the story? Had been excited about the trip. Then she found out that their beloved dog Tucker had to stay at a kennel. So I want you to stop and think about the part that we just reread. I want you to think about the keywords that I highlighted, thinking about that storytelling voice. And I want you to decide, who's telling the story? Is it Zara? That would be first person. Does it sound like the storytelling voice is inside the story? Or does it sound like somebody outside the story? So I'll give you a couple more seconds to think. Go back and really look at, reread, think about those keywords. And I want you to whisper and cover up what you decide. So you're either whispering first person or you're whispering third person. Take a couple more seconds. Third person. Right. So this example is, this story is told from the third person point of view, right? So it's a narrator outside the story. And we could tell that from these keywords because this is the storytelling voice right here, right? It was Thanksgiving morning. That's the story being told. This year, the Lee family was traveling from their home. So it's somebody outside who's kind of like looking down, you could think, on the Lee family and telling us all about what's happening, right? They're talking about Zara. She's the main character. So she's not the one telling us the story like Peter. So this isn't first person. This one is third person. So let's add that. Third person point of view. And when you're going to explain that, you're thinking because the story is told by a narrator outside of the story. And because of that, we might learn less about Zara's thoughts and her feelings, right? We would have to see as we kept reading. Okay, so now we've talked a lot about what point of view is, right? When you hear point of view, you should ask yourself, who's telling the story? And then your answer is either going to be first person, so a character inside the story is telling you the story, or third person, so a narrator outside the story is telling the story. Now you've completed the lesson. So make sure that you're thinking about this skill every time you're reading and trying to explain it to yourself, even in your head. And now what you're going to do is you're going to go back to Seesaw and you're going to edit the student template to submit your independent work where you're really trying it on your own. Don't forget, you can always come back to the video or watch the lesson again or a part of it if you need help or need something cleared up. Have a great day.